In the spring of 1925, a crew digging the foundation for an apartment house in Upper Manhattan cut 22 feet into the earth and struck something they mistook for rotten wood. One worker pried a piece loose, turned it over in his hands, and shouted a single word: bones. Above them, the city was racing to drive a new subway line north into Inwood that very year. What that crew had pulled from the wet clay would turn out to be far older than the tunnel, older than the street, older than the idea of a city here at all. It raised a question New York has never quite answered. What if the ground beneath us has been holding a version of the human story older than the one we were taught? This is the story of the giants the city keeps digging up, and what they might mean. To understand why those bones are so strange, you have to understand the ground they came out of. New York is close to the worst place in the world to go looking for fossils. The island of Manhattan sits on some of the oldest, hardest rock in the eastern United States, a foundation of schist, gneiss, and marble that formed hundreds of millions, in places more than 1 billion years ago. According to Sidney Horenstein, a geologist long associated with the American Museum of Natural History, whatever fossils may once have existed in that original rock were destroyed, cooked and crushed away by the same heat and pressure that hardened the stone itself. This is bedrock that has been burned clean of its own history. By every reasonable expectation, a place like this should hold nothing at all. And for most of the last century, the human history written on top of that stone felt just as settled. The story went like this. The first people reached the Americas near the end of the last ice age, crossing a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, when so much of the world's water was locked in glaciers that the seafloor stood exposed. They arrived roughly 13,000 years ago. They carried a distinctive stone spear point, first identified near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, and so they were called the Clovis people. They were the first. That was the rule. For decades, to stand up and claim that human beings had reached this continent before them was to invite the kind of ridicule that ends careers. The door was not just closed, it was nailed shut. So here's the tension that runs underneath everything that follows. A city built on ancient, sterile stone, and a human timeline that everyone agreed was short, tidy, and finished. Two kinds of certainty sitting one on top of the other. Except the ground would not cooperate. Because between that billion-year-old bedrock and the pavement we walk on lies a thin, overlooked skin of much younger material. The mud and sand and peat that the glaciers left behind when they melted back some 17,000 years ago. It is only a few feet deep in most places, easy to ignore, easy to dig straight through. And it turns out that this forgotten layer, this thin veneer of Ice Age leftovers, is not empty. Buried in it, scattered and broken, are the bones of an animal that once walked here, not a dinosaur. Something far more recent, and in its own way, far stranger to picture on these streets. The American mastodon, a shaggy, 10-foot relative of the elephant that browsed on spruce in a cold forest where the subway now runs. You would expect the discovery of an extinct elephant beneath Broadway to be a once-in-a-generation event, a single miraculous accident. It is not. New York has been pulling these creatures out of the earth again and again from reservoir pits and canal beds and foundation holes since before Charles Darwin published A Word About Evolution. The city has been quietly handing up giants for well over a century, and almost every time it happened the same way. Someone was digging something, and the past came up with the dirt. The first of them came up in the summer of 1858, and it came up the way nearly all of them would, out of the path of construction. The growing city of Brooklyn needed water, and to build a reservoir it set roughly 100 men to work digging out a low, spongy basin of peat in what is now the borough of Queens, a place we call Basley Pond today. As they cut down through the soft black muck, the shovels began turning up bones and then teeth, and the men understood at once that they had found something unusual. What they did not have was any framework for what it meant. Some of them, convinced the strange glossy teeth were worth money, quietly hid them away in their shanties. Much of the rest, including most of the skull, was simply shoveled back under the excavated soil and lost. Think about when this was happening. The workmen at Basley Pond were pulling an extinct elephant out of the ground a full year before Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. There was, as yet, no widely accepted science of deep time to make sense of a creature like this. A mastodon was not evidence of a vanished Ice Age world. It was closer to a curiosity, a monster, a set of teeth you might sell or keep on a shelf. And so the very first giant New York ever dug up was scattered almost as fast as it was found. That pattern, discovery and dispersal in the same breath, would repeat for the next century and a half. It was already happening on Manhattan itself. Years earlier, in 1843, a bone believed to belong to a mastodon had turned up about 10 feet down during the digging of a cellar on Broadway, near Franklin Street, in what old maps show was once filled-in wetland. It may have been the first of these animals ever pulled from the island proper, and it points to the thing that makes all of this possible. The New York we know, the grid of stone and glass, is laid directly over a landscape that no longer exists. Because to picture the world these animals lived in, you have to erase almost everything. Strip away the buildings and the pavement and the street lights. In their place, imagine a cold, open forest of spruce, threaded with bogs and slow black ponds, running down to broad salt marshes along the rivers. Where Dyckman Street now carries traffic through Upper Manhattan, there were reed beds and standing water. Where Broadway runs, there was soft ground and grazing. This was not a warm place. It was the tail end of an ice age, a raw northern woodland, and the mastodon was built for it, shaggy and heavy, browsing on twigs and cones in the chill. One by one, over the years, these animals had wandered into the soft edges of those bogs, and one by one some of them had died there and been swallowed by the peat that would preserve them. They lay in that thin buried layer, waiting, while the forest gave way to farmland, and the farmland gave way to a city. And they would keep coming up, in the most crowded place in America, wherever someone happened to dig deep enough. Nowhere more often than in one small corner of Manhattan. That corner was Inwood, the northernmost tip of Manhattan, where the island narrows toward the Harlem River and the old marshes once spread out wide. For reasons of geology, this small neighborhood has given up more of these animals than anywhere else in the city, and it gave them up 3 times over in the span of a single lifetime. The first came in 1885. A public school principal named Elijah Howland was near a drainage ditch being cut through an Inwood peat bog when he noticed a mastodon tusk lying in the exposed muck. He carried it to the American Museum of Natural History and left it there as a gift, a fragment of an Ice Age giant pulled from the mud almost by chance. The second came 6 years later, in 1891, and this time the excavation was enormous. Crews were digging the Harlem Ship Canal, cutting a navigable channel across the top of the island. 16 feet below the waterline, they recovered a tusk nearly 3 feet long, and it was formally handed over by Lieutenant Colonel George Gillespie of the Army Corps of Engineers. What makes this one matter is that a scientist actually studied the ground it came from. Richard Parr Whitfield, a curator at the museum, examined the site and described the layers with care, the peat, the grass seeds, even the preserved wings of beetles, all resting on the hard Inwood marble beneath. From that geology, researchers could reason that the animal had died somewhere in the range of 13 to 14,000 years ago in the closing chapter of the Ice Age. And then came the third, the one from the foundation pit, in the spring of 1925. As the city drove a new subway line, the route we now call the A train, north toward Inwood, a crew digging an apartment foundation on Seaman Avenue struck bone 21 feet down. It was the lower jaw and teeth of a young mastodon, still lying in the old buried bog. Word raced through the neighborhood, and a crowd gathered around the pit to see the ancient creature come out of the ground. The museum dispatched a specialist, Dr. C.C. Mook, to collect it, but by the time he arrived, the crowd had already begun helping themselves. A local milkman had walked off with a tooth. Others followed. Of the handful of teeth first recovered, only a few were saved, and some of those came back only after the museum offered a small cash reward for their return. An extinct elephant, pulled from beneath a Manhattan street, carried off piece by the people who lived there. That, in the end, is the quiet tragedy running through all of it. According to Carl Mealing, who works with the fossil collections at the American Museum of Natural History, more than a dozen mastodons have been found across New York City over the years, and almost none of them survive today. They were dug up before there was any proper place to keep them, recorded in a newspaper line or a museum note, and then scattered, reburied, stolen, or simply lost. For a long time, no one imagined bones like these could mean anything more than a dead animal in the mud. Then, in another city, in another construction site, that assumption cracked wide open. To see why, you have to travel to the opposite corner of the country, to San Diego, and to a mastodon that came up once again in the path of construction. In the autumn of 1992, a crew was widening a freeway in San Diego County when the earth-moving machinery exposed a scatter of broken bone. A paleontologist named Richard Cerutti was there monitoring the work, and the site would come to carry his name. Over the following months, a team from the San Diego Natural History Museum carefully excavated what was left of a single American mastodon, and what they found did not look like an ordinary animal that had simply died in the ground. The bones had been broken in a very particular way. The heavy limb bones were shattered while still fresh, snapped with the kind of spiral fractures you get when a hard blow strikes a living bone. Two of the massive femur heads, the rounded ends of the thigh bones, lay side by side, and scattered among the fine sediment were large stones that did not belong there, stones bearing wear and impact marks, as if they had been used as hammers and anvils to crack the bones open. To the team, it looked like a place where something had deliberately processed this animal. Then came the number. When geologists dated the bones using uranium and thorium, elements that decay at a known steady rate, the result was not 13,000 years. It was roughly 130,000. In a paper published in the journal Nature in 2017, the lead researcher, Thomas Demare, and his colleagues were careful. They did not claim these were modern humans. They could not. Instead, they proposed that some unidentified member of the human family, an earlier species we have not yet placed in the Americas, had broken these bones more than 100,000 years before anyone was supposed to be here. The reaction was swift, and it was harsh. There is an old principle in science. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And to most archaeologists, a scatter of broken bones and rounded rocks did not come close. Critics raised an obvious problem. The site had been exposed by heavy construction equipment tearing through the earth. Could the machinery itself have cracked those ancient bones and driven those stones into the sediment? Others argued that the fractures, the very patterns the team read as butchery, could be produced by natural forces alone, by the slow, immense pressure of sediment over 100,000 years. The word that shadowed the whole debate was one that haunts every site like this: geofact, a thing shaped by nature that only looks like the work of a human hand. To this day, the Cerutti mastodon remains one of the most contested claims in American archaeology, and it may never be fully resolved. But whether or not it holds, it did something permanent. It changed the way a certain kind of discovery could be read. After Cerutti, a broken mastodon in the path of a bulldozer was no longer automatically just a dead animal in the dirt. It was a question, and that question turns uncomfortably back toward New York and toward everything the city has pulled out of the ground and let slip away. So let me be honest about what New York's bones actually show, because it matters. Not one of the mastodons pulled from this city carries a confirmed cut mark. Not one shows the shattered, spiral fractured signature of butchery that made the San Diego site so explosive. None of them has been dated to some impossible age, and none has rewritten a single line of the human story. They are, as far as anyone can demonstrate, exactly what they appear to be. Ice Age animals, most of them around 13,000 years old, that wandered into the bogs of a cold northern forest and died there. On their own, they change nothing. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. But here's the part that is genuinely unsettling, and it comes not from speculation, but from the scientists themselves. New York has barely looked. Sidney Horenstein, the museum geologist who cataloged these finds, pointed out something that should give any careful person pause. At a construction site, the attention almost always goes to the bedrock, the hard stone that engineers care about. The thin layer of glacial mud and buried bog on top of it, the exact layer where a mastodon or an ancient campsite would lie, gets treated as nothing, as dirt to be cleared and hauled away. The narrow core samples that survey a site before it is built can pass straight through a buried skeleton or a hearth or a scatter of worked stone and register nothing at all. You do not find what you are not looking for, and consider the record itself. Horenstein noted that for roughly 80 years, no mastodon at all was reported from Manhattan, in a period when the island was dug up, tunneled through, and rebuilt more intensively than almost any place on Earth. Does that mean the animals stopped being there? Or does it mean that as the work got faster and more mechanized, no one was standing in the pit any longer, watching the mud the way a school principal once had? We simply cannot know. And the bones we did recover, most of them, were carried off by souvenir hunters and milkmen and curious neighbors before a trained eye ever reached them. Now, the skeptical reading of all this is fair, and it deserves stating plainly. New York's bogs may have been nothing more than natural death traps, soft ground where heavy animals became mired and died, with no human being anywhere near them for thousands of years. That is entirely possible, and on current evidence, it is the safer bet. There is no New York mastodon that points to early people. There is only the absence of anyone qualified having looked, which leaves us in an uncomfortable place. If the evidence that the human timeline here is older than we think had ever come up out of a New York excavation, would we even have recognized it? Or would it have gone the way of the Inwood teeth, into a pocket, into a spoil pile, into silence? The honest answer is that we do not know. And the only way past that kind of doubt is to find evidence somewhere that could not be waved away. As it happens, in a dried lakebed far to the southwest, someone did. That place is White Sands, in New Mexico, and what the ground gave up there was not the kind of thing anyone could argue about. Not broken bones that might have been cracked by a machine. Not rounded stones that might have been shaped by a tumbling river. Not a scatter of ambiguous flakes that a skeptic could dismiss as the work of nature. Preserved in the hardened mud of an ancient lakebed, researchers found footprints. Human footprints. The tracks of adults and children walking along the shore of a shallow lake that has since vanished, one of them following a giant ground sloth across the flats. The impression's so clear you can read the shape of a heel and the press of toes into the wet clay. This is the thing that changes the whole conversation, and it is worth being precise about why. Every other kind of evidence we have talked about can be attacked at its foundation. A bone can be broken by accident. A stone can be flaked by chance. That single haunting word, geofact, follows all of them. The possibility that nature only made it look like the work of a human hand. But you cannot argue that a footprint is a geofact. A footprint is not an object that might resemble something a person made. A footprint is the person. It is a moment, a body, a living weight pressed into the earth on a particular afternoon. There is no natural process that carves a barefoot child's stride into the mud by accident. And then came the dating, which the researchers built up in layers, each one an independent test. First, they dated the seeds of a grass caught in the print-bearing sediment. Then they turned to ancient pollen. Then to grains of quartz, using a method that measures how long it has been since the sand last saw sunlight. The samples were tested and retested, checked across separate laboratories, and the results converged on the same answer. The prints were somewhere between 21 and 23,000 years old. That is not a few centuries before Clovis. It is many thousands of years before, laid down during the frozen height of the last ice age, at the very moment the old textbooks insisted the Americas were an empty continent, untouched by any human foot. The timeline, in other words, was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong by the better part of 10,000 years, and wrong in exactly the direction that the mocked and dismissed had been pointing all along. People were here, deep in the Ice Age, walking beside the great vanished animals. Now carry that back to New York. If human beings were moving across this continent 20,000 years ago, then the giants the city keeps pulling from its subway pits and its canal beds and its reservoir mud did not necessarily belong to an empty world. They belong to a world that may already have had people in it. Perhaps not here, in this particular corner of the coast. We have no evidence that says they were. But we also never truly looked. And the animals, at least, we know were here. The only question White Sands leaves open is who else might have been walking beside them. And the city is still digging. Every new tunnel bored beneath the streets, every foundation sunk into the ground, cuts back down into the same thin layer of Ice Age mud that has been handing up giants for 170 years. The bones are still down there. And so, perhaps, is the rest of the story, the part no one thought to look for, lost again and again to a souvenir hunter's pocket or a core sample that slipped past it in the dark. Somewhere under a New York street, sealed in old bog beneath the bedrock, everyone was watching instead. Another shovel is waiting to strike something that looks, at first, like rotten planking, until someone turns it over and looks closer. The human story here is not finished. It never was. Certainty, in the end, is just a question no one has yet dug deep enough to ask.